Hello and welcome. You're watching NewsX. My name is Gauri Kundalia and we are starting a very special broadcast. Now, the two-day No Money for Terror conference begins as India continues its efforts against global terrorism. PM Modi inaugurated the conference and urged that all terror attacks must be addressed with equal outrage and action. In a veiled attack on Pakistan, PM Modi pointed out that there are nations that support terror financially and as part of their foreign policy. Home Minister Shah chaired the first session of the day on terror financing. He highlighted the importance of acting against the growing influence of Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Asia. He also addressed the rise of cryptocurrency and hawala transactions for terror funding. Interestingly, Pakistan and China skipped the conference as 78 other nations discussed ways to counter the use of crowdfunding platforms to finance terrorist activities and weak control mechanisms of social media platforms. We now have special guests joining us to provide a deeper insight into this menace of terror financing, which is a problem globally. They have faced it and done incredible work to fight and battle against this. Joining us now, Sari Singha. She's the 2003 Israel bombing survivor. Jordan Cope also joins us. He's a Qatari fellow at the Middle East Forum. Also on the broadcast with us, Irina Sakamun, author and human rights lawyer based out of New York. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to begin with you, Sari. I'd like to first tell our viewers a little bit about yourself. In 2003, if I were to understand, Hamas set off an explosion on a public bus in Jerusalem and you were on it. Tell us about your experience first, because we need to understand and establish firsthand of what living with terror and terrorist attacks actually is like.
Sure, thank you for having me. In 2003, on June 11th, I boarded bus number 14 in the center of Jerusalem, right near the bus station. It was very, very crowded. It was rush hour. Many people, innocent people, were on their way home from work. There were children on the bus. There were people of all ages. Mm-hmm. And at the next bus stop, 2 seats opened up in the front section on the right side, and for some reason I sat down and I moved in next to the window. And if I didn't take that window seat, I wouldn't be here today. And I know that because the girl sitting next to me did not survive, and her boyfriend was standing because the terrorist was right next to him. The terrorist detonated after a bus stop that was very, very crowded. People were coming from the marketplace, so they were picking up groceries to go home to make dinner for their families. And what ended up happening was it was one of the largest terrorist attacks, bus bombings that Israel had had. He detonated. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't think it was a terrorist attack. It was during a ceasefire with Hamas at that time. And over 100 of us were injured. And 17 innocent people were murdered, including everyone seated and standing around me.
Right. Ms. Singha, right now, you also are the founder and director of Strength to Strength. You are in your own way helping victims of terrorism in the world. Tell us a bit about your work.
So Strength to Strength was established out of a need because when I returned back to the United States, I had no support system. Mm-hmm. There was nowhere for me to go to have that support with other people that had been through the similar experience. So I started Strength to Strength with the idea that we would partner with organizations on the ground that were established NGOs that were working with victims of terrorism and their family. And we offer peer-to-peer support, bringing victims together no matter what their background is, their religion. If you are a civilian and you are in a terrorist attack and there is an NGO in your country, then we want to work with you and make sure that you are not alone, that you have a support system, and it's really a global peer support group. And we run many different programs, including retreats and recreational and educational programming. And therapeutic programming for anyone, whether it's a survivor, a bereaved family member, or a first responder, or any of their family members that need support. Because we realize that not only the victim is impacted by a terrorist attack, but usually their family and sometimes their extended family is impacted as well.
Right. So, Ms. Singha, what are, in your experience, what do these survivors need mostly? Is it the physical support? Is it psychological support? And how do you build these kinds of support practices within your organization?
Sure. So immediately, everyone, runs in when there's a terrorist attack, and there needs to be that physical support in the beginning. And I think anyone who is injured, whether it's physically or psychologically, needs to be evaluated and get the support they need, no matter what country they're in. And that is the responsibility of the governments of every single country, to make sure that when there's a terrorist attack on their soil, that they are taking care of those victims and their families instantly. We come in after the fact, when the media fades and the victims are sort of forgotten. And then it's the long-term support. It's not only the physical injuries, but it's the psychological impact, the post-traumatic stress, everything that encompasses what you go through when you've dealt with something so traumatic. And so we're there to help support and make sure that people feel that they're not alone. And it's very, very difficult, especially in places like, we have survivors that are in our group from Mumbai who survived Mumbai, but they had nowhere to go to after the attacks. They didn't know what was going on, and it was being connected to them through the State Department at the U.S. that enabled them to get the support that they needed, and the long-term connection and peer support that is helping them to get through some of the most difficult times in their lives.
Right. Ms. Singer, you are working, and your organization is working at the very grassroots level, where you're helping people on a case-by-case basis. But if we sort of extrapolate this, how important do you think are these conferences then, where countries are coming together to talk about stopping financing terror? And we know there are some prime suspect countries which do indulge in these kinds of practices. So how important a global sort of effort is of this stature?
So first of all, it's nice that there are these conferences and they come together, but sometimes when the countries that are the perpetrators are assisting and carrying out these attacks and allowing the terrorists to do what they do and helping to fund them, if they are involved in this, then all these conferences make no difference. It's just a lot of talk. And there needs to be more oversight and more accountability by governments and by nations around the world to stop the terror financing, because if they stop the money trail, then I believe there'll be less attacks. There's less incentive and there's less ability for attacks to be carried out. Governments not only need to have oversight over where money is going when they send foreign aid to different countries, but they also need to know where that money is going when it leaves them, and they need to know the paper trail. And a lot of governments and a lot of people that I've spoken to, especially in various parliaments, they don't know what happens to that money when it leaves the government to go to help sometimes the neediest people in certain countries. And there needs to be that accountability and oversight across the board. It can't just be one or two countries dealing with it. It needs to be a global issue that everybody is engaging in.
Right. All right. Moving on to our next guest now, Jordan Cope joins us. He's the Qatari Fellow at the Middle East Forum. Jordan, first, talk a bit about your work. What is your expertise, and what are your findings most importantly?
Of course, and first and foremost, thank you for having me. So, as the Qatari Finance Fellow at the Middle East Forum, I was recently exposed to documents that were revealed to the Middle East Forum. These documents ultimately pertained to charity, quote unquote, charity distributions, 45,000 grants of worth almost $770 million to approximately 70 countries around the world. Now, the Eid Charity claims to be a non-government organization, but if you look at its board of directors, 6 out of the 7 bear the title Sheikh and the last name Athani. Long story short, it's an affiliate, most likely, of the Qatari government, and it has been regarded as such. And so, of those grants, approximately $75 million worth were distributed to affiliates of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, to Hamas, and to IHH, which is a terrorist organization largely in Turkey, but has also been designated in certain parts of Europe. And so largely I helped expose and translate the Excel sheets, which are available on the Middle East Forum's website if you look up the Eid Charity files. But in addition to that, recently I've also been doing some further research into the Eid Charity files. And as we're talking about what can be done about terrorism, the situation is sadly not optimistic, and that's because the United Nations has been receiving money from the Eid Charity. Just to give you a little bit more information, in the United States, there is a designated terrorist umbrella fundraising organization called the Union of Good. And two of its member organizations have given approximately $50 million to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Those two charities being one, the Eid charity, and the other, the Qatar charity. And what's so astonishing about all of this is that the High Commissioner for Refugees at the time, when it began its relationship with the Qatar charity, was who is now the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres.
Wow, okay.
So sadly, we can't really trust international organizations to spearhead the cause of terrorism, especially at the UN, where in recent years, they actually voted down a resolution to condemn Hamas.
All right, so if you're saying, Jordan, that the UN is not that effective in this sense, what do you suggest then? Are these conferences now the way forward? Because then you have to get stakeholders together. There's no way one country can do this all by themselves. We need people onto the table. We already see that Pakistan and China have skipped it, which is, well, I would say admission of guilt, but I won't jump the gun here. So my question is, how important is it for everybody to come together on a platform? It does not necessarily have to be the UN.
Of course, and I think these conferences are very noble. And I definitely think it's a good first step for getting countries to come together to spearhead the cause of terrorism. What we have to remember, though, is at the end of the day, there's approximately 193 countries, 78 countries or so, if I recall correctly, were present at this conference. And it's a good starting point, but we need to rally the rest of the world to take terrorism more seriously. And there's a reason why, unfortunately, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Lashkar-e-Taiba and other such like groups have yet to have been designated as terrorist organizations. And it's because there are a lot of countries that are nobly spearheading the anti-terrorism cause, such as the US, Israel, and India.
Right.
And some countries as well in Europe.
Yeah, like France, for example. They're the first ones to actually hold this conference.
Right, but we need at least to call a spade when it comes to terrorist organizations, and Europe sometimes struggles in doing so.
Right, okay. Jordan, I'd also like to pick your brain a little, because let's talk about Qatar, which is your area of specialization. What are the regular methods which have been used for all these years to finance terror, be it shell companies or offshore transactions, etc.? These are some of the regular methods that we know of. But what are the new emerging methods that we also need to look into? There is crypto, there is crowdsourcing, like so many things that we need to talk about. So help us distinguish a little bit between these regular channels and these newly emerging channels.
Right, and it is a very complicated subject because there is so much we don't know about we don't know about terrorism financing because it's just so vast and it's often so secretive. What I've largely dealt with has not been per se cryptocurrency, even though it's becoming more and more of a problem. In addition, I mean, charity has often been used as a channel to allow Qatar to fund terrorist organizations and to engage with them. And as I mentioned earlier, $75 million worth of grants given by the Eid charity to affiliates of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, to affiliates of Hamas, and to IHH. And so we need to understand that this charity often is not used for humanitarian, for construction purposes. And the best case example is why the ambassador of the Eid charity, Mohammed El-Ahmadi, was meeting with high-profile Palestinian Islamic Jihad officials, inviting them to his quote-unquote residency. The problem is the Palestinian Islamic Jihad doesn't engage in a diplomatic process. It's strictly, and for the very most part, a militant organization. And so this is just but one of Qatar's greater soft power initiatives to allow it to gain influence in regional hotbeds. And it's part of Qatar's strategy, especially as manifesting throughout the Arab Spring, where it supported Muslim Brotherhood affiliates in their power contest. And so how do we stop Qatari, what I would call state-sponsored terrorism, which the United States hasn't yet realized? It's important to expose its soft power initiatives. And these soft power initiatives aren't just exclusive to the Middle East and North Africa.
Jordan, we're almost at the World Cup now. And
of course.
if that is not a soft power initiative, I really don't know what it is. It is also the media. You've spoken about Qatari state media and their propaganda, but also, I mean, let our viewers know that we're at the heels of International Football World Cup, which is taking place in Qatar, and Jordan will tell you, viewers, what Qatar is up to. Help them also understand what is going on around the World Cup as well.
Of course, many soft power initiatives ongoing. Qatar has largely massaged the West. It's become the fourth largest spender of all countries in the world in terms of lobbying spending in the United States. It is the second largest acquisitor of foreign military sales with the United States, $5 billion to US universities in recent decades. And in addition, it sought to influence the youth by sponsoring soccer clubs throughout the world. In the past, it sponsored FC Barcelona. It also sponsored AC Milan and has very strong ties as well with Paris Saint-Germain. And so what's dangerous is Qatari state media, which glorifies, celebrates terrorists, refers to them as martyrs, has now made appeals to become more palatable to the young progressive audience in the West, funding AJ Plus, which has millions of subscribers amongst millennials and has channels in English, French, and Spanish.
Right. Thank you, Jordan. We'll move on to our next guest before we discuss this further. Irina Sakumin, she's an author and human rights lawyer. Irina, begin with telling us a bit about yourself and your work, and then we discuss this further.
Thank you so much for inviting me here. In addition to my human rights work, I'm also a national security lawyer, and I'm a geopolitical analyst, president of Scarab Rising, which is a media and security strategic advisory. I've been active in the field both on an academic level, recently authoring a paper on the financing of the Muslim Brotherhood, and as well as co-authoring a pamphlet focused on Qatar, and also on practical level in terms of advocacy and public writing for more popular audiences. My most recent research has focused on the connections between Qatar, Muslim Brotherhood, and other state and non-state actors, and innovative methods of communication and financing that has emerged and that goes towards terrorism.
Right. So what are your primary findings then, Irina? Let's talk about the Muslim Brotherhood. When we talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, there are blurred boundaries when it comes to their political aspiration and ambitions are also concerned. So an organization like that, what did you find out as far as who is funding them and financing them is concerned?
Qatar is actually one of the major state funders of Muslim Brotherhood, particularly in Europe. It's worth noting that Muslim Brotherhood relies on a number of different channels of funding, from direct fundraising to family cell-based infrastructure, to accepting funds from the adherents around the world in Western countries, to accepting state funding to mosques and various soft power institutions. But they've become more sophisticated and more aggressive in fundraising, from relying exclusively on their internal networks and using methods such as real estate investments and Hawala networks and other small direct transactions. They've moved on to infiltrating big tech companies and essentially using financial investments in those companies via countries such as friendly countries such as Qatar to launder money, to move money around. They have designated sophisticated individuals in various states such as the U.S. who have doors open in financial institutions as well as NGOs, academia, and government institutions, intelligence agencies, who are able to move money around quickly without attracting attention, and that's not directly traceable to the Muslim Brotherhood. Also, while there's been a lot of discussion about leadership crisis in the in the Muslim Brotherhood between the Turkish and London branches, with the head of the Muslim Brotherhood passing away recently. The reality is these political battles have little to do with the funding mechanisms, most of which are actually based neither in the United Kingdom nor in Turkey, but actually in Germany, where this remains relatively out of sight, precisely because so much scrutiny is geared towards the political apparatus rather than the fundraising mechanism. And in Germany, these Muslim Brotherhood affiliates very successfully network with other mobile and group as well as state funders from various countries, and they have a relatively free room to roam. Germany has been trying to crack down on Hezbollah, but on Muslim Brotherhood not so much.
Right. Irina, I will ask you a hypothetical question. Now, India is leading this initiative, this conference which is taking place. Now, if you were to suggest some action plans or pointers to them as to this must be done in order to stop finances to these terror organizations, what would your suggestions be?
The biggest mistake that has been done by governments in recent years was by the US designating Qatar as its major non-NATO ally, which gives it all sorts of privileges as a military power and as a political ally, and essentially it avoids scrutiny for anything. Qatar has been under investigation by the Department of Justice for alleged funding of the IRGC, but that has been under wraps and no findings has been shared with the public. The new Congress, the Republicans in the House, should be calling for financial investigations into suspicious transactions and support for terrorist groups and for Muslim Brotherhood by Qatari sources, by Qatari charities, including in the United States, and other countries around the world should be doing the same. To the extent private citizens and news agencies have a role, they should certainly be highlighting these transactions. They should not be giving Qatar a free pass in exchange for generous donations, whether into the media, into human rights organizations, or financial infrastructure. Instead, they should be questioning the nature of these transactions and these donations, and highlighting the route by which these transactions end up in the hands of assorted extremists and terrorist groups. We've heard for years about alleged donations from the very same royals to Hezbollah, and ransom payments that went on to fund extremist militias in Syria. We have ongoing lawsuits in several countries concerning these extremists, but Qatar ends up being taken out of these lawsuits as a sovereign state, and even its agents end up being financed by Qatar for their own lawsuits, their lobbyists, their agents. This veil needs to be pierced, and there's got to be a way of holding at least Qatar's agents accountable in the countries where they engage in whitewashing of Qatar's crimes.
Right. Now, before we wrap this, Sari, I'll come back to you for your suggestions also. If you were to make these suggestions to this conference, what would those be?
Again, to me, it's really simple. I know it's not simple in practice of what needs to be done, but there needs to be this global accountability. And when countries and member states are able to not only help to finance, but help to perpetuate terrorism around the world, and no one does anything about it, including the UN, that presents a bigger problem, and it almost gives the acceptance of what's going on. We need more accountability. We need there needs to be international laws that are stronger, that are making sure that there are consequences with the terror financing. There also needs to be more oversight on banks. There needs to be accountability on the side of the banks when they are funneling the money where it needs to go. And while that is a difficult thing and it will take discussions, that's what the discussion should focus on. And I believe that if they can stop the money trail and if the money can stop from being funneled, there will be less terrorist attacks. That is our way to fight back. And for me, I am personally on a number of lawsuits against banks that help to finance terrorism. And to me, that's my way to fight back. If I can stop the terrorists from getting what they need in order to accomplish and carry out, then that's my way of making sure that the next victim doesn't go through what I went through.
All right, Jordan, your suggestions?
Yeah, I think Sari hit the nail on the head when it came to the banks and the global accountability, which we're unfortunately currently lacking. We need, I guess, to expose media outlets that continue to glorify terrorism. We need to make sure that that narrative doesn't become popular. In addition to that, there's money that goes into terrorist organizations, which we need to hold the actors who provide that money accountable, such as Qatar, which has given $1.8 billion to Hamas since 2012. Such as Iran, which has given $700 million up to $1.1 billion a year to Hezbollah. But regarding Hezbollah, and this is where the second part comes in, money going in, where's that money going out from terrorist organizations? In Lebanon, Hezbollah has established a very strong welfare system, and we need to make sure that Hezbollah can no longer have those funds to create a welfare system in which in return it gets a support and allegiance. We need to make sure that we can detach people from the programs that Hezbollah might provide to get their false allegiance in return, and that's how it's entrenched itself. I think those are good stepping points, starting steps, but we also need to call a spade a spade. The world needs to designate Hamas. The world needs to designate Hezbollah. The world needs to call out these terrorist organizations in the UN, and they also need to do so for terrorist organizations that have plagued India, such as Lashkar-e-Taiba. And the few countries that are committed to fighting terrorism, such as the US, Israel, and India, need to keep on spearheading this and to rally as much support as they can in their efforts.
All right, Jordan, you spoke about calling spade a spade. Our Prime Minister today, in his inaugural address, also made a similar statement. He said, and I quote, "All terrorist attacks deserve equal outrage and action." Irina, your thoughts on this? Do you think there's duplicity when it comes to recognizing what is terror and what is not? Do we finally need to come at a definition of terror which is applicable to all?
The problem is, oh, so sorry, go ahead.
All right, go ahead, Irina.
One of the chief problems has been the difference in the definition of terrorism between various countries, which prevents, for instance, the United States from designating Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, despite the fact that not only it funds terrorism, but there is evidence it took direct part in terrorist operations in various countries. This legal gap is being exploited by extremists, but there is more to be done. There are positive steps that need to be taken. There needs to be a coordination on intelligence sharing and on coordination on counter-terrorism and counter-extremism efforts that are aimed at exploring and highlighting the ideology and not just the terrorist operations, which actually are a very small percentage of all of the activity that goes on by these groups behind the scenes. Much of the activity is political, subversive, and public, rather than clandestine and violent. Third, Muslims, especially and their allies, have to have platforms to counter the extremist organizations that have taken hold of soft power institutions. In the United States and in Europe, civil society organizations, civil rights organizations, think tanks are operating under the auspices of the Brotherhood and other organizations, and they are being protected by the government. They are training intelligence agencies, they are infiltrating intelligence agencies, and any criticism of them results in a choir of attacks, reputational damage to any critics, and accusations of Islamophobia. And these very same people shut down any criticism from within their own communities, causing an atmosphere of fear that prevents Muslims from calling them out. So these critics need to have support. They need to have institutional support and need to have greater legitimacy to avoid these civil groups speaking for the entire Muslim communities in various parts of the world.
Right. Jordan, finish your thought and we wrap.
Yeah, I think Irina is very much correct. I mean, I think just at the end of the day, we also should push for global recognition of terrorist organizations. It's very difficult to come up with a definition for terrorism internationally. It's been tried, it's been hard to enforce. And the sad reality is it's because there are a lot of countries who just simply aren't interested for political reasons. And so we just need to call spade a spade. It's that simple. Hamas, Hezbollah, Lashkar-e-Taiba, they're terrorist organizations, and we need to recognize them as such.
All right. With that, we've completely run out of time. I'd like to thank all our guests for joining us, Sari Singha, Jordan Cope, and Irina Sakowit. Thank you so much for joining us today.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.